ladies and gentlemen, 25th anniversary seems scarcely possible. I suspect that quite a lot of us here now were here 25 years ago when it was founded. But the 25th anniversary, even though it seems so recently that we were founded, it's a reasonable time to look back. How do you know where you are unless you know where you've come from? Good motto for explorers and for other things too. Well, it's almost true, not quite, but almost true, that modern conservation as we know it really didn't start until after the last war, in the late 40s and early 50s. And if you look back to those times, surprising how different the emphasis was in those days. People were concerned, biologists, naturalists, amateurs, people interested in the wild world. People began to notice that individual species of animals and plants, but mostly animals, were becoming rarer and rarer. And a group of naturalists and scientists and administrators got together and started the conservation movement, with in fact the World Wildlife Fund as being one of the pioneering organizations. And the emphasis in those days was very much on species. You saw the panda, the giant panda, or you saw the Hawaiian goose, or you saw the Arabian oryx, and you were seeing them getting fewer and fewer in number. And the people then said, we must do something about it, very commendably. But what did you do? Well, the initial reaction, believe it or not, was to find the survivors and put them in zoos. It was a sensible thing to do on the face of it. Looking back at it now, perhaps it wasn't as sensible as we all thought then, because I was around then as well as anybody else. A giant panda, a Javan rhinoceros, an Arabian oryx in a zoo pen, you might argue is hardly a real panda or a real oryx or a real rhino. It's something else. It's something that's gone. It's something that's half dead. It's something that's a museum specimen. It's not a real wild animal. And as if to emphasize that, in the early days, it was very difficult to get those animals to breed. And as years got by, even when you did get them to breed, you realized that actually you couldn't just take them from a zoo pen and put them out into the wild world, because they didn't know about the wild world and they didn't know how to survive. So that wasn't the answer to the disappearing species that was troubling so many people. And so the move shifted. Perhaps we should create reserves around these one particular species, these charismatic species, and we could focus attention on them and give them the leafy circumstances or the desert circumstances or whatever that was natural to them. And so small reserves were created. But they didn't really work either, because the size of the reserves was a problem. And nobody really knew how big the reserves should be anyway. And anyway, people were beginning to get a little more sophisticated about what conservation meant. It wasn't about just one species, however charismatic it might be. It was about the other species, which that one species was just an emblem for. It was, to use a word that was surprisingly less familiar than it is today, it was about ecosystems. If you really want to preserve the panda, you have to preserve the bamboo forest. If you want to preserve the bamboo forest, you have to conserve and look after a lot of the insects, which are factors in the survival of the plants on which various animals live. So the concept was already widening. But then serious work was done to see just how big these areas should be. And it was primarily in the early days in the Amazon. And they discovered that some species could be conserved in a quite small area, but other species required huge areas. So again, there was a subtle shift. A shift to realize that if you wanted to conserve the world and to conserve the species that were in it, you had to take a big section of land. And then it began to dawn on people that actually in many of these areas where species lived, there was other species too, human beings. And so suddenly there was a shift. Suddenly people began to realize that conservation was about planet, wild areas of the planet, and also semi-civilized areas, as you might put it, with all the creatures that lived in it, including humanity. And if you were really going to conserve the wonderful creatures which give us all so much joy, the realization was that you had to take a broad view, and you had to look at whole areas of land. And then suddenly the penny began to drop, that actually there were people living in these large blocks of land. And from some arguments it could be that it was their land. Certainly they had to have a voice in this matter. And it didn't matter whether people on the other side of the earth were simply prepared to give money, if in fact the people themselves living on these lands, living alongside the creatures that we were so concerned about, weren't aware of what was going on and weren't in sympathy with what was going on. And so at that point, 25 years ago, perhaps a little more, at that point, a completely new focus of the meaning of the world, nature, conservation came into the world. If you're going to conserve nature, you have to conserve the whole community. And within that community, a strange, powerful animal called Homo sapiens, that too had to be thought about and catered for. And that if the world at large thought it was important that giant panthers or Père David's deer or Arabian oryx should survive, then the world should subscribe through the areas in which those animals, in which those people were living alongside the animals. And it was at this point that the World Land Trust, with John Burton, began to formulate important ideas. There was a huge support and sympathy throughout the most populous parts of the world, but also one of the wealthiest parts of the world, to help the natural world and the people who lived in it. And so the concept grew that what we should do was for the West or developed parts of the world who had money would help those parts of the world which very often the animals we're concerned about and plants we're concerned about lived, that we should give help to them. And so the notion grew that not only would we raise money, the WLT would raise money, but it would also raise expertise to help people with conservation knowledge gleaned from all around the world to solve those conservation problems. But the people, the indigenous people, the local people, were central to all this. If the local people were not persuaded that it was right, it wouldn't work. And it is, in my view, one of the great achievements of WLT that it brought this about. WLT now is a major factor in many parts of the world, channeling funds and help and expertise into those areas where they are so badly needed, but leaving the ultimate control in the people who live on that land 365 days of the year. Conservation has been transformed. WLT is at one of the cutting edges of that transformation. And those of us, and all of you, and you here, who are involved in WWT, can congratulate yourselves on this 21st anniversary and this great shift in understanding of what has to happen if conservation is to work. So I congratulate WLT, and particularly all those who work for it, including John Burton, and particularly you who support it. If there is one shaft of light and hope in looking ahead at what's going to happen, it is, in my view, that which you see when you see the history of our World Land Trust and of the change of attitude in the World Land Trust and the generosity which people who help the World Life Trust have helped it to spread its influence worldwide. So congratulations to the fund, and thank you all very much indeed.